Well, good morning, everybody. Happy New Year again. It's exactly 40 days since January the 1st, the beginning of the new year yesterday. Kind of an interesting coincidence. And I had the opportunity to go down to Livingstone House and join some of the lectures for the Divine Principle seminar that was going on. Because I wanted to say, when I came here today, I've already been to a workshop this year. And being there, I was reminded of my very first workshop, which was years ago in California. And I remember one of the first topics we discussed was the need for new truth and the difficulty of a world that thinks it already has enough truth or doesn't need any more. And on that first workshop, I remember we were told a story to illustrate the difficulty of people hearing and uniting over new truth. At the time, I thought it was very cute, but later on, I began to have doubts. For those of you who don't know that story, it's mythical, of course, but concerns a king somewhere who realized that his advisors never agreed with each other. If one said up, the other said down. If one said peace, the other said war. So finally, he wanted to show them by experience that they didn't have the whole story. And this is the story where he blindfolded them and then brought them to something they hadn't seen before, which in this story was an elephant. Don't know where he got an elephant from. And according to the story, each of these blindfolded men came across a different part of the elephant and interpreted it differently. One grabbed a leg and thought it's like a tree, another a tusk and thought it was a spear, the tail was a rope, and the trunk, which was full of water, a hose pipe. So I thought, yeah, that's very cute. But the next week, I happened to attend the workshop again, and this time, the analogy was a different one, which I realized I liked a lot better. And that was of a group of people setting out to climb a mountain. The same mountain, but from different starting points. Some of them starting together and others out of sight from each other. And as they climbed the mountain, they got divided, came to a fork in the path, and some of the party said it's definitely left, and the others said it's definitely right. And even there might be some animosity, and finally people had to make their choice. We're going left, we're going right. And they thought, we'll never see them again because they're wrong, and they've taken the wrong path. But eventually, everybody arrives at the top of the mountain, and they're surprised. The people who thought part of their company took the wrong path are surprised and maybe a little chagrined to find that actually they weren't wrong. It was just another way. And then, of course, they also met people who'd come by a completely different path and yet still reached the summit of the mountain. I realized I liked that better because the first story kind of starts with the thought, well, everyone's ignorant. Nobody knows anything. Which is a bit depressing, right? To think in that story, everybody is wrong, actually, because they're ignorant and partial. In the second analogy, everybody is right, ultimately, but they don't realize it until they reach the summit. All the way until the summit, they think that they're the only right ones. But finally, the truth is revealed, and they recognize, actually, there were other ways. There were other paths. So I like that better. Now, there are many holy mountains in the world. The title is Climb the Holy Mountain. But there are many. So since there's not many of us, I'll ask you to name a few. Zion, the one we had there. Kailash in the holy mountain of Hindus and Buddhists in the Himalayas, another one. Gethsemane, pretty small, but yes, I guess it counts, or the Mount of Olives there. Somebody mentioned Mount Fuji, and it wasn't Fumiko. But Mount Fuji, of course, a holy mountain in Shintoism. What about in Islam? What would be a holy mountain? Could be Mount Hira. I was thinking of Jabal al-Nur, the mountain of light where Muhammad received his revelation. There's Ararat in Turkey, although the Armenians wish it was still in Armenia. Or even closer to home, Kirkpatrick in Ireland, the holy mountain where people still go on pilgrimage to meet St. Patrick. So there are many holy mountains, and some of them are quite small, and some of them are extremely large. But not all of these holy mountains are huge, in fact. How many of you here have been to what we used to call Cheongpyeong Training Center, the H.J. Chunwon? There's a little mountain there, right? On top of which is the Tree of Blessing. And it's not so difficult to go up, although I have met people who, to make it more difficult, decided to go up walking on their knees. That made it quite a bit more difficult. But anyway, it's just, a couple of 100 meters. And True Father, in his autobiography, talks about climbing a mountain behind his home when he was a student in Seoul. I've been there to Huksakdong, and it's really not much of a mountain. It's really just a hill. But Father would go up there in the middle of the night, every night, to be a little removed from the hustle and bustle of the city below, and even perhaps from his studies and his mundane things, and to try to focus his mind upon God. Later on, when Father was released from Sodaemun prison, he came out to find disarray in the community, and he says in his autobiography, I needed to find a mountain to pray. And so he went down to the middle of Korea to a mountain that also had a Buddhist monastery up on top of it. And he went up there. And while he was there, he realized the only way forward is to spread out to the world. And so he began the task of seeking for the first missionaries to go to Japan and the world. And for that matter, not all mountains are even physical at all. For example, I think you're familiar with the story of the temptation of Jesus in the desert for 40 days. And at the last temptation, it says that the devil appears to him and takes him to a very high mountain from which it's possible to see all the kingdoms of the world. And promises Jesus, if you will fall down and worship me, I will give you all of these kingdoms. But I don't think Jesus actually physically climbed a mountain. This was a mountain in the mind, as it were. And later on, in Revelations 21, when St. John is receiving a vision of the kingdom to come. In 21:10, it says the angel took him to a very high mountain, and from that mountain he received the vision of the city of God, the New Jerusalem, descending from heaven. So there are different mountains. Some of them are physical, some of them are spiritual. And it's not so simple as just climbing up the mountain and coming down again, because as we study a little more, we find two types of problems surrounding the holy mountain. The first problem is for the ones who don't climb, the ones who stay down on ground level while the leader, the prophet, the saint ascends the mountain. This was the problem, as the story goes, for those Israelites who waited while Moses was on top of Mount Sinai receiving the Ten Commandments. Now, that may be a later story, but the point is the people who don't climb the mountain are also supposed to have a reverent attitude. They can't think, well, our leader's gone, he's doing his business with God, and we'll just carry on. Or maybe, as that story went, we'll just let ourselves go. You know how it is, right? When you let yourself go, your discipline that you've had for a long time, but you feel, I've done enough. I've come far enough. It's time to relax a little bit. And there's always a voice in our heads telling us, it's okay, you can relax. You've come far enough. Time for a break. But that's a very serious moment. We'll come back to that idea in a little bit. But the other thing is, what about for those who climb the mountain? Go back to the beginning of this sermon again and imagine that you've reached the top of the mountain and you've discovered that there are others on the top that you didn't expect to see who've made a similar climb of faith, but you can't stay there. You know, if you've ever done any mountain climbing at all, I've done some, not technical, but certainly high mountains. The higher you get, the colder it gets. The less place there is to stand. The weather's extreme. There's no food. You can't stay there. The climb itself is the challenge, but you have to come back down again. And often, when you're at the top, you notice to your dismay, there's another mountain, and it's even higher. And with a sinking feeling, you realize, I'm going to have to climb that one as well. But there is a temptation to try to stay when it's already time to go down. True Mother has put a new interpretation on that same kind of story. Instead of climbing up a high mountain, she said that all faiths are like trains arriving at the same station. So you may come from a different place as you did today, but the point she makes is that when you arrive at the station, you have to get off the train. I mean, sometimes when I'm traveling late in London, I see people who don't get off the train, right? They're just riding from one end of the tube to another because they have nowhere else to go. But normally, when you arrive at that destination, you have to get off. And you have to continue your journey on foot. And if you don't, of course, you won't make it to your destination. So let me ask you, does that only apply to other faiths, or do you think it also applies to us in the Family Federation as well? Do we also need to get off our train and continue our journey on foot? Of course, says Aniko. Yeah, I mean, when I was younger, I superficially thought, that's talking about other people, you know, because they don't know the divine principle, because they don't know the truth about true parents. So they have to get off and they have to come to where I am. But gradually you realize, no, this applies to me as well. I also need to move on as God directs me. So I think our True Mother at the moment has reached that summit, and she's looking around at the world as it is and how it should be. And I think she sees many things. We hear that she has many sleepless nights and tearful nights when she considers all the conflicts. She called me up at 3 a.m. one morning to say, pray harder for Ukraine. Pray harder for Palestine. Don't think that that's somebody else's conflict. But there are many others that she sees everywhere. And of course, she's very concerned about the damage being done to the planet by human neglect or even willful destruction. And she's concerned about the division in Christianity, thinks about it all the time because it's urgent for God that the Christian community and indeed all faiths come together. She's thinking about the division of North Korea. You know, for 70 years, Korea's been divided. William and I went to Korea 40 years ago to the Korean Olympics. And I remember meeting the British ambassador because we were asked to meet the ambassadors. And he told me to my face, Korea will not be united in my lifetime. And he wasn't that old. I thought, you're wrong. But actually, he was right. And still, Korea remains disunited. So you might think, as Mother looks at all these things from the top of that mountain, she might be discouraged. And And I'm sure that temptation comes often. But at the same time, I think she clearly sees the day when, as the prophet Isaiah says, the people of the world will turn around. Almost everybody knows verse 4 about beating the plowshares into pruning hooks and the spears into plows or whatever it is. In fact, if you go to New York, outside the United Nations, you'll see an enormous sculpture there of that very verse of the spears being beaten into weapons of peace. But that sculpture was donated by the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. What people forget is that to reach that, we have to go verse 2 and 3, where the people of the world turn to the law of God, without which there is no peace. I'm sorry, I'm really struggling with my cough. So I suspect, I intuit that in True Mother's mind, and maybe in God's mind as well, these two emotions and these two feelings are in tension with each other. On the one hand, the reality as we see it, a world in chaos with conflict everywhere, and on the other side, the promise of what could be if only we turn to our Heavenly Parent and seek His way. It was the failure to do that that led to all the problem in the first place. And I think it's important also to understand the intensity of God's desire, of true parents' desire, that humanity, the intensity of the feeling that humanity makes the right choice this time. I think that it's all-consuming. It isn't something that, every now and then God thinks, yeah, it would be nice if my children made the right choice today. I don't think so. It's the type of intensity that parents feel if a child is missing or a child is in hospital at the last moment. There's nothing else is important than that feeling. And we come to the second quote, where now 16, 17 years ago, Father said, if you understood what was going on here, how important this day is in history, you wouldn't be able to sit still. You'd go dancing throughout creation, singing songs of joy. Well, I was there that day. I'll be honest with you, I was sitting still. I was sitting in my chair like you, looking at the stage, thinking, wow, this is great. The palace is open. Father and mother are there in their crowns. All I have to do is watch. I think I missed the point that actually sitting still is not going to finish the job. Thank you, Fumiko. So, for True Mother, coming to her again, this is not something vague to happen at some distant time in the future. No, she's actually been bold enough to write the date in her calendar and our calendar. Do you know what that date is? Free coffee for anyone who knows the date. April the 13th, 2025. Not so far away, right? It will pass in a flash. And that's the day that True Mother has set for what she calls the entrance, the consecration, the dedication of the Holy Temple, the Chanwanggung and its sanctum to God. It's not a physical thing, of course. Some of us have already been there and seen that building in its almost complete stage. But I think what True Mother is thinking of is something much more spiritual and much more universal. She really doesn't want it to be just another temple. There are enough temples in the world. But her hope is that it will be a place where people can feel the divine, loving, feminine, masculine presence of God, the Heavenly Parent. And not only that, but the people who come legitimately can be said to represent the people of the world. I say legitimately because, of course, limited by time and space. The whole 8 billion people of the world can't come there. But those who are there should really represent the different religions, the different traditions, the different nations and languages. One of the ironies last year was that we had many such people in Korea. But the day was changed because of weather. Maybe there were other reasons. Just 2 days. But in those 2 days, all of those invited guests, almost all of them had to go back. So the opportunity was missed, or maybe it wasn't quite ready in the first place. So what about us? We're coming to the point here now. How do I prepare? How does my family prepare for this important date? The date upon which True Mother is, as we say in America, betting the farm. You know, if you name a date and commit to it, there's really no turning back. 14 months. I think to understand that, we need to also consider what does it mean, to climb this holy mountain, to reach the summit that true parents have already reached. And the way I see it is it means attending to the fulfillment of the 3 blessings in my life. This is not a time to go into a lecture on the 3 blessings, but you'll remember that they encapsulate the simple totality of what God hopes and wants for all of his children, not just unificationists, but people of every faith and of none, of every nation. And the first, of course, the first blessing, how would you describe it in non-religious terms? For me, it's really quite simple. To fulfill the first blessings means that I am at peace with myself, I'm at peace with my conscience, and I am at peace with God. That I can say to God, as it's said in Luke 2:29, now, Lord, let thy servant depart in peace. In other words, that I have really done everything that I can do. But I'll be honest with you, there are very few days in reality when at the end of the day I can say to myself, I feel like I did enough today. There are not many days like that. And many days when, in fact, I'm not at peace in my conscience. But it's not impossible to get to that state. I realize it needs more effort. The second blessing means to be at peace in my family. I think many of us here, most of us here, are married. And I know from direct personal experience that if you're not at peace with your spouse, if you have had a fight or some dispute, nothing else matters. You have no power, you can do hardly anything at all until you have resolved that. Probably I might be the only one who's had that experience, but it will come to you at some point. And how do you do that? The only way is genuinely putting them first. If you put something else first, even if it's the church, even if it's the principle, it doesn't work. We're all possessed with this incredibly sharp sense that knows if we're in first place or second. Of course, you can put God first if really that's God. But if it's some religious duty or some feeling of obligation or tradition, that's not enough. The Chinese proverb goes, no peace in the family, no peace in the nation. And of course, no peace in the world. The family is also the place where we have to practice the different kinds of love appropriately. I say appropriately because if you practice the love of a parent to a child to your spouse, it's quite likely not going to work. If you treat your children as if they were your parents, it won't work. God expects us to learn not only the nuances of love in the family, but also the right order so that we can practice it elsewhere. And lastly, of course, the third blessing. We live in a world right now that is burning up. Apparently, we've just crossed that 1.5 Celsius barrier that people thought might take till 2050. Of course, it will go down again. Mother is always talking about the need to care for the planet. We used to talk about the third blessing in terms of dominion. We take dominion over creation. Human beings are the subject, but I think it's easy to misunderstand what dominion really is. It's dominion through serving. It's dominion through loving, through caring. And it starts right at home. Fumiko and I have the opportunity often to be invited to visit people in their homes. And it's quite surprising how often we don't see heavenly dominion there. Often these are very dedicated people. They're doing amazing things outside their home, but inside their home is not in order. I mention these things because these are things we can all do something about. We are all called in this next year to climb the holy mountain to that day, symbolic though it may be, when we want to stand with True Mother and say, the dwelling of God is with men. And we don't want that to be postponed 30, 50, 100 years. We're meant to see it in our lifetime. So this year is the year to climb the mountain. Now, again, from experience, I know that mountains always look formidable from the bottom. When you look up to the top, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. I don't think I can make that. My knee's not so good. My lungs aren't holding out. I don't think so. But the only way to do it is to start. And once you start, not to stop. But I have some good news for you. I realize we have already started. We started back on January the 7th when we began this special 40-day period of devotion and prayer and fasting. And for all of you who've participated in that, thank you. So we're already almost 40 days on that journey. And the number 40 is a very interesting one. When you look into the different scriptures and traditions, usually something happens after the 40 days, right? After 40 days, basically, you can expect one of two things. One thing could be a revelation, an insight from God, something that you didn't realize before that will really help you on the rest of the journey. But it's also possible that after 40 days, you will receive instead a confrontation. Think of Jesus being confronted by the devil in the wilderness. And a confrontation is a recognition there's something that you have to solve and overcome before you go any further. So today, I think, is day 36, right? We have 3 more days left after today. Fumiko and I are leaving early Tuesday so as to be in Korea on the 40th day. So let me ask you, and indeed, we're going to have a little pair sharing in a minute. Are you ready for revelation? Are you ready for confrontation? Which one will it be? Actually, God will decide. Because if you need confrontation, if there's something that God wants me to solve, I won't receive a revelation. I can expect a confrontation. But it's the right thing for me. For somebody else, it might be that what they need is a revelation, something insightful. But whichever it is, God will decide what is best. So at this point, I'd like to do a little pair sharing, just with the person next to you, or if you prefer not to share with the person you came with, you can choose someone else. Please spend just a few minutes discussing whether you anticipate revelation or confrontation, and then we'll come back to conclude. Okay? So, please. Maybe I can just see a show of hands. How many revelation? How many confrontation? Okay. Yeah, we have work to do, don't we? Anyway, I just want to give you my confession that I believe God knows. God knows what we need. God knows what our family needs. God knows what our nation needs. But even Almighty God cannot do that by himself, right? Or herself. If could, that would have happened a long time ago. So even today is not too late to really seek the answer from our Heavenly Parent. What do you need from me now? And Father always used to advise us, try to keep it real. I think I told you one time before that we were praying at East Garden, and Father, unknown to us, had come in and was listening to everybody's prayers. And then, he kind of cleared his throat, and we all looked up, and Father said, I've been listening to you pray, and you're all praying for amazing things, but most of you are making the mistake of praying for things that are far away, that you can't do anything about directly. He said it's very difficult for God to answer that kind of prayer. The type of prayer God wants to hear is where you're praying for something that you yourself can be the instrument of God to change. It's much more reasonable. It doesn't mean to say you shouldn't pray for world peace, but what about the peace right in front of you? So, remembering that friendly advice of True Father, as I begin this new year, I'm thinking I want my prayers and my efforts to be more realistic, closer to home. Sometimes that's the most difficult place to start. Let's have a prayer like that right now. Our loving Heavenly Parent, good morning. We thank you for this day and for this new year that we've just started by the lunar calendar, the heavenly calendar. Whenever we set the date for a new year, we have the opportunity to make a resolution, a commitment to try to be different. But if it's just intellectual, it won't last long. We need to make a change in our hearts. If we lack confidence, we have to find it again, and we have to find it in community with each other. This is a small congregation here in central London. But yet, it is larger than many congregations that went on to change the world. Jesus had but 12 disciples. Just a small handful of people crossed the ocean to America and became the Pilgrim Fathers. It doesn't have to be a huge number, but it does have to be a number that is really committed to you and to each other. We have 3 days left until True Parent's holy birthday. We really want to come to that day dancing with ecstasy, feeling the joy that True Father said, not burdened by the mistakes we might have made during the year, but rather uplifted by the possibilities that may be so close in front of us. Thank you once again for this morning. Please bless and be with each family as we go about our week and this new year. I offer this prayer and report in the name of Mike and Fumiko Balcom and all the blessed families here. Adieu.